The United States has approximately 2 million prisoners, making up 25% of the world's total incarcerated population. They are held in state, federal, and starting just a few decades ago, private prisons. Private prisons, also known as for-profit prisons, first appeared in the 1980s to cut back on public prison spending. But have private prisons proven to be more efficient, especially in terms of their operating costs and recidivism rates, compared to their public counterparts? In retrospect and through observation, private prisons are arguably equally or less efficient than their public counterparts. So how do private prisons compare to public prisons in terms of their costs? First off, the main perceived advantage of private prisons is their lower costs. It is my common perception that private prisons are cheaper to operate and save the government money. Private prisons operate in the private sector and are thus subject to competition from other businesses, which should make them cheaper and more efficient. Kaminsky. In theory, to drive down costs, private prisons must compete to secure a contract. However, the perception of the free market securing the best price becomes a bit questionable in that there are an alarming drought of competing firms in the private prison market. In 1999, for instance, there were only 12 for-profit prison firms. Since then, further shrinking that number, 18 of those original competitors have been merged or bought out, with only two new firms forming at the same time to replace them. The American Federal, State, and County Municipal Employees reports this. Furthermore, the two most dominant of those for-profit companies, GEO and CoreCivic, together account for over 85% of all private prison beds in the United States, according to Riviera. It represents an overwhelming market share by very few firms, characteristic of an oligopoly. Allowing just a couple of firms to control the vast majority of the total private prison market, this lack of competition inherently reduces the government's bargaining power, as firms with such large shares of the market can exert greater bargaining power over contracts. Market shares aside, research on a case study basis also seems to rebuke the idea that private prisons reduce costs. A study by the Arizona Department of Corrections, for instance, found that minimum security public prisons and private prisons both incur similar costs, especially after accounting for varying medical costs between the two. In Mississippi, it was found that private prisons cost the state $46.50 per prisoner per day, as opposed to those held in public facilities at between $35.11 and $40.47 per prisoner per day, according to the Mississippi Department of Corrections. Given this research, private prisons appear to be generating equal, if not greater, costs relative to their public counterparts. It overturns the notion that private prisons are more efficient, at least in terms of their financial cost. Well, what about their performance? How do private prisons compare to public ones in terms of their operational offerings? Another prominent argument for the continuation of private prison operations is that they offer superior operational innovations for additional cost savings. However, the main method of cost saving in private prisons is to post lower salaries for correctional officers, making up 65% to 70% of private prison operating costs. Private prison guards typically receive $7,000 or less on average than their public counterparts, according to Austin and Coventry. In addition to having lower salaries, private prisons tend to hire fewer officers with an officer-to-prisoner ratio of 6.9 instead of the average 4.9 ratio seen in public prisons. In addition, private prisons have greater average staff turnover, with a rate of 53% relative to public prison turnover rate of 16%. This is significant because it means, at least in the field of staffing, private prisons are less efficient than their public counterparts at hiring, training, and maintaining staff. Well, is it not fine if there is a difference in operational procedures as long as they are not compromising quality? In theory, yes. However, there have been multiple recent instances of private prisons understaffing. In 2014, for instance, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration ruled against GEO for understaffing as a workplace hazard in Mississippi, according to the United States Department of Labor. Furthermore, in 2014, the FBI investigated an Idaho private prison because its correctional officers had even started negotiating with prison gang leaders in order to make up for the understaffing, according to the Idaho Department of Corrections. Clearly, some major cost-saving innovations and measures of private prisons are actively cutting corners without preserving overall quality. With poor compensation and lower staffing rates, private prisons run the risk of sacrificing general safety and effectiveness. Aside from safety, though, how do the outcomes of private prisons compare to their public counterparts? Another important measure of prison efficiency is their recidivism rates and prisoners' sentence lengths. In a recent study by Anita Mukherjee, Assistant Professor of Actuarial Science, Risk Management, and Insurance at the University of Wisconsin at Madison's Wisconsin School of Business. She reviewed private prisons operating in Mississippi, where private prisons account for around 40% of all prisoner beds. From her research, she found that private prisoners on average see their sentences lengthened by 4 to 7%, equivalent to 60 or 90 additional days. This is significant because each prisoner occupying a bed earns private prisons $50 per day on average, meaning that just an additional 60 days is roughly equivalent to another $3,000. It is a concerning trend as it provides an example of the financial incentive for private prisons to not encourage reform and increase sentences served by their prisoners. Mukherjee summarizes this trend and its implications, stating, "If inmates sent to private prisons somehow serve longer terms, this undermines the very cost-benefit that makes private prisons attractive relative to public prisons." One of the largest concerns with private prisons is that they operate on incentives more detrimental to society in the long run than their perceived savings and benefit to society in the short run. In short, the benefits of private prisons are at best questionable. They have seen mixed cost-effectiveness, poor operational procedures, mixed outcomes, and operate on immoral incentives. As a result, it begs the question of whether or not prisons should only be run by the government or if effective policy could be implemented to change and reform them. A frequent criticism of private prisons is how they are not subject to the same transparency rules as public prisons. Could forcing greater operating disclosures help the gaps in performance and introduce more positive incentives? Or can new contracts and compensation be based on private prisons' outcomes and effectiveness? Private prisons are a work in progress. They began as a cost-saving experiment, however, they have raised questions in retrospect of their true efficiency and superiority over their public counterparts.